Hi folks, Jean here, and welcome to another episode of Have You Ever Read? This month we have a fantastic show lined up for you. I'm talking to Dr. Chris Wadibia about Bishop Tom Wright's Surprised by Hope. Chris is a proper theologian and it really comes through in our conversation. This is a great book about I always get that wrong. This is a great book about eschatology. Now, you might be wondering, what's eschatology when it's at home? Well, eschatology is a fancy word to describe the afterlife, which includes heaven, hell, and everything in between. Dr. Wadibia is a fellow at both the universities of Oxford and Cambridge and studied at Georgetown University. So we spent some time talking about life as a Christian in academia. I found this to be a highly stimulating conversation. If you usually listen to this podcast on 1.5 speed, you may want to slow this one down. Anyway, that's enough from me. Enjoy this episode of Have You Ever Read Surprised by Hope by N.T. Wright with my friend, Dr. Chris Wadibia. Welcome to the show, and who are you and how do I know you?
Well, wonderful, Jean. Well, to begin with, thank you so much for having me on your show today. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you. So my name is Dr. Christopher Wadibia. I'm a junior research fellow in theology and religion at Pembroke College, Oxford, as well as an affiliated lecturer in the Faculty of Divinity at the University of Cambridge, where I completed my doctorate a few years ago. And so to answer your question, how do I know you? So we went to church together in Oxford at St. Aldate's, and we remember on one occasion on a Sunday morning, I think it was just before one service at St. Aldate's, you and I were chatting, and that led to you inviting me to speak at a business conference at the business school. And that went brilliantly well. And I ended up speaking about Nigerian Pentecostalism and social investment. And then we were also recently at a Christian entrepreneurs dinner in Oxford, also attached to St. Aldate's. So I think St. Aldate's has really been the facilitating mechanism behind our friendship.
Agreed. I actually didn't realize that that's how we met for the first time. I thought somebody else introduced us. You know how things are. You never really know.
Uh-huh.
I never really remember how to meet people. Anyway, so Chris, Dr. Chris, really grateful that you could join us today. So you mentioned that you're a theologian, which is fantastic. Yeah, it would be great to tap into your mind. But before we go into that, can you tell us the book you've chosen to talk about and why?
Yes, absolutely. So I think, when you approached me about this conversation, you asked me, what book would you recommend to others if you could? And I think one of my great passions within the field of Christian theology is Christian eschatology. And the term eschatology refers to the last things of this age. So naturally that implicates concepts of heaven and hell and the afterlife and those things. And I'm particularly passionate about that subject for a number of reasons. One having to do with, in my personal life, I've lost people, my father and others, and from a personal theological perspective, I'm devoutly Christian in my own capacity, in my own right. I find Christian eschatology to be a great source of comfort and encouragement. But also, I think a lot of my research has focused on megachurch Pentecostal Christianity and social development in the majority world. And I've interviewed so many individuals that are marginalized and ostracized and ignored. And for them, eschatology is also a very inspiring and empowering theological subject. The concept of looking forward to the life to come after this present age is something that really strengthens their spirits and gives them courage to face each day. So for today, I've chosen the book Surprised by Hope by N.T. Wright. Mm-hmm. N.T. Wright is one of the, if not the world's most famous and leading Christian theologians. Yep. He's living in Oxford at the moment. He's incredible. I was blessed and privileged to host him for lunch at the college several months ago. And his book, Surprised by Hope, is an accessible theological work that challenges some of the popularly prevailing conceptions about what the Bible says on issues such as heaven, hell, and the afterlife and eternity that many Christians globally have. But when you deconstruct them, you realize that those ideas that these Christians have are much more rooted in popular culture, especially secular popular culture, than they are actually the Bible themselves.
Yeah. And we can go into more detail on that because I think there's even more to pull out around Greek philosophy and how that has influenced our modern day Christian thought, which is obviously, yeah, really interesting. Anyway, before we dive into that, so you mentioned that you are a theologian. Now,
Hmm.
people listening to this will probably, firstly, want to understand your Christian faith. So, my undergrad is also in theology. But and I know my story of why I chose to study theology, right? I had a Christian faith already and actually wanted to study more, like to be able to study the Bible a bit more deeply. And I actually went into it with a mind of apologetics, but I came out with it with a different viewpoint. But it would be interesting to know how one you came to Christ and whether or not that led you to theology or if it was vice versa.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I would say so. I grew up in Southern Alabama. My father passed away when I was 12, but he was a migrant from Nigeria, and he was an academic in the United States. He was Anglican. You know, Nigeria has one
Hmm.
of the world's largest Anglican communities, but he was heavily influenced by charismatic Christianity in the
Hmm.
United States. My mother grew up Lutheran, and at the same time has been also quite heavily influenced by charismatic Christianity, especially the American variety. And so my family is devoutly Christian. I grew up in Southern Alabama in a context where religion is very socially influential.
Hmm.
Politically, if you're a politician, try getting elected if you're publicly if you publicly self-identify as an atheist. Good
Hmm.
luck with that. Economically, a lot of faith communities in Southern Alabama, especially the Christian communities, especially denominations like Southern Baptist Christianity and
Hmm.
evangelical churches and charismatic churches, they're quite large organizations and structures. And so they function as these social gathering places. And naturally, by way of things such as tithes and offerings, a lot of these churches become quite wealthy
Yeah.
in a way that makes them economic players in society, especially when it comes to doing social welfare
Hmm.
work and stuff of that
Yeah.
nature. A lot of these churches also have businesses or
Hmm.
colleges or high schools or elementary schools that they'll operate and independently administer. So I would say the combination of my family's positive example of Christian faith and also growing up in a Southern Alabama context where religion is so societally relevant and influential,
Yeah.
that really shaped my worldview. So,
Okay.
it's interesting when you grow up in a Christian context, you can immediately be, sometimes you can feel as if you were immediately inserted into a position where it's naturally appropriate for you to culturally identify as
Hmm.
Christian.
Hmm.
But that
Hmm.
doesn't necessarily mean that you take your faith very seriously.
Yeah.
So for
Yeah.
me, I would say that became the biggest priority in my life when I was 14 years old. I remember that the high school that I went to was attached to the church that I attended. The high school was called Faith Academy.
Hmm.
It's still running today, and it's attached to the church, which is called Life Church, and that school very much functions as an educational extension of the church. The church
Okay.
founded the school.
Yeah.
Okay. And we would go to chapel. We would have a morning devotion over the intercom every morning.
Hmm.
And so being at that school, I think also gave me access to a lot of very positive mentors in the Christian faith that were teachers, that were coaches, that were administrators. When my father passed away, I didn't have many positive male role models outside of the school I attended and the church I attended.
Hmm.
But luckily, inside those two spaces, I had an abundance of positive male role models, almost all of whom were publicly devout Christians.
Okay. And so that led you to take the personal step for yourself to faith.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. And then from there, how did you jump to, I'm going to take theology as my way forward, my career?
Oh, absolutely. Well, it wasn't a hop, skip, and a jump, I would say. So for my bachelor's, I studied politics at Georgetown University in
Yeah.
Washington, D.C. And I think it's good to mention this. I grew up in a context where, and maybe this is largely associated with evangelical Christianity. It's not enough to be a cultural Christian.
Hmm.
You have to passionately take your faith seriously on a daily basis.
Yeah.
For me, from a very young age, from the age that I was 14 onwards, my faith came to be demonstrated in the way that I spoke to every person, in the way that I did every academic assignment in school, in the way that I exercised. It was very much imbued into the holistic fabric of my life.
Okay, so like basically doing everything unto God.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Colossians
yeah,
three
yeah,
seventeen and
yeah.
3:23, do everything as unto the Lord, giving thanks to the Father through Christ. And so I would say that when I went to Georgetown, I immediately developed a reputation of being a very religiously devout student, but also someone who, and I think a lot of this has to do with my family upbringing, someone who's quite intellectually open-minded.
Okay, so just on that, I know
Uh-huh.
I keep interrupting you,
That's
but
okay. Don't
do
worry.
you
Take your
think
time.
that the juxtaposition of you coming from the south versus then moving to like the north east coast, did that play any role? Well, it's not the east coast, but you know what I mean,
No, it
further
is the
up
East
into
Coast.
okay, it's the
Yeah.
east coast.
Uh-huh.
Do you think that exaggerated what people thought of you in terms of your faith?
I think yes and no. Georgetown University is one of the, if not the oldest Catholic universities in America.
Okay,
It's also Jesuit.
okay,
And for that reason, faith and Christian spirituality is very much imbued into the fabric of
right,
Georgetown.
okay,
So I think on the one hand, going from a place like Southern Alabama to Georgetown was actually quite a natural religious evolution, because I went from one place that took Christianity seriously to another place that did.
okay,
On the other hand, Georgetown is also quite big into interreligious understanding and interreligious dialogue. It has 5 different uh, chaplaincies, for
okay,
one for Protestantism, one for Catholicism, one for Islam, one for Judaism, and I believe one for Buddhism or Hinduism. And so that was my first, I would say, large scale exposure to religious diversity
okay,
in a way that inspired me to take my faith seriously, not in a dogmatic sense, but in more of a interreligious fellowship sense.
okay,
Because I really do believe that if your Christian faith is sincere, and also if the Christian message is true, then it at no point should it ever be intimidated by a
yeah,
competing message. At no
exactly,
point,
yeah,
ever,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
ever,
yeah.
ever. So yeah,
Okay,
keep the
interesting.
questions coming, Gene. I can
And
do
so,
this all day.
yeah, we will get to the book. Don't worry. And
Uh-huh.
so, what I guess what I'm trying to one of the things, and you were in academia, so you would be able to give a brilliant insight into this. Is I know we have a lot of listeners from North America, and some will be parents, and a lot of people are thinking about the situation on campus for Christians.
Uh-huh.
And now both you and I did theology at decent universities.
We tried.
And yeah, we should
Hmm.
exactly. And I've never felt that my Christianity was under attack. At the universities I went to, similar to you, my universities all had a Christian foundation to them. So
Hmm.
even in the theology department, it was a lot. I mean, most of the people there were Christian, like that were
Hmm.
studying theology. But I know that people are afraid of this emerging. Well, this is why I hear because I haven't experienced it. Emerging view that Christianity is under attack on campus.
Mm.
Do you have any like? Firstly, do you have you seen that yourself being in this academia? And if
Hmm.
you have, what advice would you give to maybe students or people going into university
Hmm.
about their faith? Because you mentioned that people saw you as intellectually curious, but at the
Hmm.
same time, people knew that you had your faith. So, what
Hmm.
advice could you give to people who are trying to navigate that space?
Yeah, well, I'll begin by encouraging the listeners to get their popcorn ready because it's about to go down. Uh, I would say, so for the first bit, did I see, when I was at Georgetown in my educational journey, have I seen, say, Christians being under attack for their faith? You know, I think at Georgetown, I, yes, but at Georgetown, I was very heavily involved with university politics.
Okay.
And I think that is a very distinctive environment to be in,
Mm-hmm.
where I ran for class president, and I remember when I was campaigning, people were like, "Oh, he's a Christian from Alabama, so he's probably going to be very socially conservative and all of
Mm-hmm.
those things." And I would say that that is an example of my Christian faith branding me in some
Mm-hmm.
way. I remember when I was at Georgetown, I was the quarterback for the college Republicans for 4 years when we would play the annual, I think it was the Georgetown Day game at the end of the year. So I think being in a political arena, even on a
Mm-hmm.
university campus, where your religious beliefs are going to be interpreted, especially by your opponents, those you're competing against for
Yeah.
election, as a factor that might have ideological implications for students on campus.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in my experience, I think, at least at Georgetown, people who run for class president, I think they hugely overestimate the amounts of influence that they're going to have when they get in office. I mean, it's not like you're going to walk into the president's office and say, okay, this is what I want. And they're going to say, oh my gosh, let's do this. No, I mean, in many ways, it struck me at least as a ceremonial position.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, I think, particularly in an American context, imagery and optics matter. And America is one of those Western countries where religion is extremely influential in politics,
Mm-hmm.
extremely influential. If Donald Trump didn't have the evangelicals, he would not have a chance
Mm-hmm.
of becoming elected. So, to answer your question short, did I see that dynamic of anti-Christian or critical Christian sentiment targeted at me when I was at Georgetown? Yes, but
Mm-hmm.
not in the sense of I was targeted specifically because of my Christian faith,
Mm-hmm.
divorced from the broader
Yeah.
political context in
Yeah.
which I was contesting for an election. Okay,
Okay.
so I would say that's that. Could you remind me of one of the other two
The
questions that you
second
asked?
was about. Sorry, I'm asking a lot. Sorry.
That's okay.
The second was around people who may go into that situation where they face that dynamic of
Yeah.
being criticized for their Christianity. What would you say would be the best way to overcome that and
Yeah.
kind of change the narrative?
Okay, that's great. That's a lovely question. So when I was at Georgetown, I had the privilege of giving a TEDx talk. So I gave a TEDx talk it's on YouTube and the TEDx website or wherever that is, and it's
I'll put a
on.
link to it in the show notes, so that's fine.
Link
I'll
it up,
find
Gene.
Yeah.
Link it up. It's called Being Fully Human, and the argument that I presented in there is that having a sense of spirituality is a fundamental component of being human.
Mm-hmm.
It's very interesting when I come across. I had an article in the Times last year, the Credo piece. If you also want to link that up, this is
Yeah,
a
I will.
shameless plug.
Yeah.
Shameless plug. And it was on the evolution of British Christianity.
Right.
And one of the things I find interesting now, in that article, I was talking about how you have a lot of migrants that are coming into the UK from Nigeria and Latin America. And a lot of these are devoutly Christian, and they're bringing
Mm-hmm.
their faith with them with
Yep.
the intention of evangelizing the Western world,
Yep.
especially because the Church of England has a declining rate
Yeah.
of its population.
Yep.
So what I argue is that it's not so much that Christianity in Britain is just categorically declining. I think what we're seeing is that it's evolving, it's
Yep.
shifting, and it's changing. Even if you look at the Church of England, Black women, for example, constitute a significant demographic presence within the Church of England.
Yeah.
That would have not been the case 50 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And who knows how that's going to look in 50 years from now. And that's why it's important for individuals to do research to be able to give us that sort of foresight and wisdom on issues of policy and combating social challenges like what we've been seeing in the UK over the last few weeks with these riots,
Yeah.
a lot of which are targeting issues of race and religion and
Yeah.
stuff like that. But for individuals that go into academia, I would say one of the lessons that I learned from that TEDx talk that I gave was that TEDx is a fundamentally secular platform,
Mm-hmm.
but I used it as an opportunity. And if you watch that talk, I spoke very openly about my faith.
Yeah.
My faith is central to who I am. I believe in speaking openly and passionately and sincerely, but never dogmatically,
Right.
because I believe that's what Christ did.
Yeah.
Christ never was dogmatic,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but he was always powerful and he was always authentic. And
Okay.
he's our role model.
Yeah.
So that's that. I would encourage listeners that are going into academia. One, I think, and this is another New Testament biblical message, but as a Christian, on the one hand, you should always be ready to patiently endure criticism
Mm-hmm.
and negative attention just
Yeah.
because of your Christian faith. I think in a way, if anything, that kind of verifies the authenticity of your Christianity because
Yeah.
it's biblical, it's scripturally consistent with
Yeah.
the New Testament.
Yeah. We share in the sufferings of Christ.
Exactly.
Yeah.
100%. Preach it, Gene. Preach it. So there's that. On the other hand, I find people forget often that of the approximately 7 or 8 billion people in the world, Christianity is by far the world's largest religion.
Yeah.
By far.
Yeah.
There's about 2.5 billion Christians.
Hmm.
Uh, by 2050, it's expected that there will be approximately 3 billion Christians.
Right.
It will still be the world's largest religion. Islam is number two with about 1.8 billion or so, which means that there's anywhere from 6 to 700 million people more than the world's second largest religion that identify
Hmm.
with the Christian faith.
Yeah.
We are a significant proportion of the world's population.
Yeah.
And I think when you let that sink in intellectually and emotionally, I think that can actually be extremely empowering.
Yeah.
Because whilst in your small context, you might feel like a minority, in the big ocean, you're a member of the big group.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
see? So I
Yeah.
think that that can actually be quite encouraging. I would also say that for individuals that are entering academia and want to be a powerful witness for their Christian faith, I would say take every platform and apparatus and opportunity that you have, secular or not, to inject varieties or elements of your Christian faith into the external realm,
Hmm. Hmm.
from your
Hmm.
life into society,
Yeah.
into the department, into your class, into your modules. And don't wait for explicitly evangelistic opportunities.
Yeah.
You
100%
know,
agree.
in the sense of you shouldn't be waiting for an opportunity to go preach at your church to give an example of your faith.
Mm.
I was at a dinner in Oxford last night at Lincoln College, and towards the end of the dinner, I was attending a conference. And towards the end of the dinner, I remember I was sitting next to three individuals, one individual from Scotland, and then two other individuals from England, two lawyers, and then a policy person. And we were talking, and it very quickly evolved into a Christian apologetic section
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
I was the only theologian at this conference, and I was
Yeah.
specifically invited because I am a theologian. It was
Yeah.
a conference on employee ownership and making the dynamics between owners and employees more
Equitable.
inclusive and
Oh,
equitable and those things. Okay,
amazing.
and one of the things I thought was interesting was that at times it felt like 3-on-1 in this
Hmm.
conversation, and that's okay. That's all right. The good Lord made me a big boy, not just physically, but also spiritually, in the sense of I can handle it. I'm very comfortable
Hmm.
uh, engaging in apologetics. And at, I would say, dozens of high tables that I've been to at Oxford over the last 3 years, I have spoken about my faith to professors, senior fellows, masters, heads of house. That it's who I am.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
cannot get it out of me. Okay.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I noticed last night is that, I might not have persuaded them, but that's not really my responsibility.
Hmm. Hmm.
My responsibility, I think, is to honor the Lord in the way that I speak to them and in the account that I give.
Yeah.
Do I
Yeah.
want to persuade them? Of course. Do I want every single person on the planet to have an intimate and passionate relationship with Jesus Christ? Yes, I do, 100%. But I also realize that I am not their Lord.
Yeah.
And it's not my responsibility to convict them. That's the Holy Spirit's
Exactly.
responsibility.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think there's that, and I think that that can be very encouraging to individuals entering academia that are devoutly Christian. Another thing I want to highlight is that, particularly in the theological academy, theology is a very interesting subject in that a lot of individuals in the academy that study theology are not necessarily religious at
Hmm.
all.
Yeah.
They just find it a stimulating intellectual exercise. And
Hmm.
that's cool, but I do think that it has led to a system in which you have a lot of theological material that is getting published that is not from a confessional
Hmm.
place. It's more from a professional place of I want to get tenure and I want to get promoted in my job,
Yeah.
which is good, but I think, Christian theology is not like politics
No.
or political science or
Yeah.
international relations where you can come up with anything that essentially that you can come up with that is legitimate should be welcomed.
Hmm.
I think in Christian theology, I genuinely do believe that all theology is speech about God in a way that should be spoken and articulated with reverence to the fact that there are billions of people in the world that take speech about God seriously.
Yeah. And
And I think
experience it. and
and
experience it.
experience it via their lived religious experience every day, every hour of their lives. And so in the theological academy, you have a lot of individuals that are publishing a lot of material and getting promoted and becoming chairs of whatever, and they don't have an ounce of faith in their heart.
Hmm. Hmm.
And there's something about that that just strikes me as theologically, or rather, inappropriate from the perspective of religion, devout Christian religiosity. Because at the end of the day, I would argue that a true Christian theologian, their scholarship is an act of worship.
Yeah.
It's an act of worship. And I think that that's really significant. And that's why, and this is a wonderful segue, because that's why I was so moved by N.T. Wright's work, Surprised by Hope.
Hmm. Hmm.
Because N.T. Wright, as you know, is a longtime member of the clergy.
Yeah.
He's taught at every major university when it comes to theology. I think he should be up for a promotion at the University of Jupiter next, and then he can move on to the super planets because there's nothing really else for him to do in terms of accomplishments on this planet. He's done it all. I've met him. He's also one of those individuals who, when you meet him, he's as impressive interpersonally as he is intellectually.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I loved about his book was that he was very clear in challenging this argument that says, when you pass on from this life, it's not so much in terms of the grand eschatological scheme of things that you go to heaven as much as it is heaven comes here.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
And heaven breaks through
Yeah.
to the earth. And then you have the new creation and the new earth and the new Jerusalem and all of those things. And I think that is a very powerful message that growing up in Alabama, I never heard that once.
Never myself.
Not
Never. Yeah.
once.
Yeah.
And I have literally been to thousands of religious services in my lifetime. Not many. I'm only 30 years old, but I've been to a couple thousand,
Yeah.
And I can count, prior to coming to the UK, actually, I could probably, and prior to engaging with N.T. Wright's work, I had maybe heard even the term New Jerusalem, New Creation, maybe a handful of times.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
find that to be quite significant in a negative way, given the fact that the new creation is literally like the end game of Christian eschatology.
Yeah.
It's not like an hors d'oeuvre. It's not like dessert. It's like the main course in a
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
Theosis, having that eternal fellowship, not just with Christ, but with also all believers and being the bride of Christ. But also at the same time, and N.T. Wright gets about this or engages with this in his book, eternity will be a place of work.
Hmm.
It will be a place of community. It's not just a place of relaxing and reclining. It's God created human beings to be co-administrators of his creation.
Yeah.
And when the new creation breaks through and we move on from this age into the eternal age, humans will spend all of eternity building up and further developing God's creation
Yeah.
in a way
Yeah.
that promotes the good and the beautiful, in a way that magnifies God, in a way that pleases God as an act of worship.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the central concepts that's communicated and argued in N.T. Wright's book, Surprised by Hope.
Yeah, so you've said so much there. So I think we have to step back a bit
Let's
to
step
kind
back.
of give the listeners some context. So Surprised by Hope, as Chris has said, is fundamentally about, he said this earlier, it addresses some of the doctrinal, I don't want to say falsehoods, that's too strong of a word, but maybe misunderstandings that we've inherited over the years. And so N.T. Wright, he's a theologian, and as you can hear from Chris, such people, they kind of build their argument. It's not like just make a claim. They actually build their argument from first principles. So N.T. Wright does this by first explaining in the first section why there's a problem about Christian understanding about hope. And he talks about the way culture views Christianity and the way Christianity has responded to that interpretation of culture. And then he goes into the definitions of what the fundamentals of Christianity are all about. He defines who Jesus Christ is. He talks about the different sacraments, I think he does in this section. And then he moves on to the resurrection. And he explains exactly what the resurrection was and what the resurrection is. And he explains to us, and this was a major takeaway from me, that he talks about resurrection and what that means in terms of the afterlife. So for most of us, as Chris said, we've assumed that heaven is the end game. We assume that when all is said and done, when we die, we're gonna go to heaven. But N.T. Wright makes the point that actually that's not what the scriptures strictly say. What the scriptures talk about in terms of the life after death is, yes, when we die, we're gonna go to sleep, and maybe this is where people are who have died now. But then, there will be a resurrection when all of us are resurrected, our bodies are resurrected, and then we enter into the new heaven, the new earth. And how this relates to Jesus Christ is that many of us have rejected the concept of our bodies being resurrected, and we just talk about the fact that our souls are going to heaven and hell, or hell. But what N.T. Wright explains is that when you look at Jesus Christ, when he was resurrected, his body was the same body that the disciples knew. He was, as it were, what word can I use? Glorified in such a way that his body was made to appear differently, but it was the same recognizable Jesus Christ. And as such, that will be, and if Jesus Christ is who we are, who resurrection is mirrored after, it's safe to assume that is going to be the case for all of us. I hope I'm getting it right so far, Chris. Like, correct me if I'm wrong.
Professor Jean is in the house, listeners.
And so if you're following all of that piece around the resurrection, you get to this place where actually, when we are resurrected in our new bodies, what's the point? Like, where do we go from here? And this is where he makes the point that actually, when you read the scriptures, the way it talks about Christ coming back rather than us ascending to Christ, it also talks about Christ appearing. And N.T. Wright goes into the Greek and he explains that is, I think the word is parousia. I think I want to say for presence, and don't quote me on that, listeners. And what what that actually means is that the presence of Christ is always here, but we can't see it. And so, to Chris's point about when he says that heaven was a coming down, it's almost like, as the scriptures say, that we see through a lens, darkly. I can't remember what it says in the I'm using the authorized version. It's almost like the scales are removed from our eyes, and at a point we will see heaven and we will see Christ in this current form, and that earth and heaven will be, in a sense, become one. I hope I'm explaining that clearly.
Yes, I think that's brilliantly articulated, Jean.
And so, as Chris said, like, for me, that was a game changing, like, and I think I said this on the episode before around John Mark Comer's book, Garden City. Both this book and that book has really made me think I need to really, as you mentioned, I never know how to say that word, but the E word.
It's okay.
Eschatology, right? Eschatology.
There you go. Well done.
So it's really made me question and understand and think, okay, what is heaven? What is hell according to the scriptures, rather than influences from culture or from Greek philosophy. I don't know, Chris, if you want to explain that piece a bit more, explain where that comes from.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I think, so it's important, and this is one of the arguments that N.T. Wright, but also other scholars and other Christian theologians and more popular writers make. Another good one is Randy Alcorn.
Yeah.
So Randy Alcorn, he's not nearly as theologically dense or sophisticated, one might argue, as I am right now, as say N.T. Wright and others.
Yeah.
That being said, I love the spirit of his work. And also, if we're going to be totally honest, most Christians that are reading eschatology are not reading the highly dense stuff.
Yeah.
They're not going. Go ahead.
And it is dense. It is dense.
Oh, it is deeply dense.
It's dense, yeah.
I mean, if you think the word eschatology is long and difficult to pronounce, you haven't seen anything yet.
Yeah.
You know? So most who are reading about these subjects and topics, they're reading people like Randy Alcorn. His book Heaven is a bestseller, especially in the United States, in the evangelical heartland of America, in the Bible Belt. And I love, and I genuinely believe he's the spirit of his book, and aligned with many of the arguments that he makes, really captures what I think the New Testament spirit of eschatology in terms of truth and revelation is getting at, but also what N.T. Wright communicates, just in a much more theologically robust,
Yeah.
nuanced,
Yeah.
and I think sophisticated fashion.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but the key point here is that for Christians, your eschatology should not come from culture.
Mm-hmm.
And you might, when I say that, you might be like, oh, is culture talking about eschatology? And this is a point that I want to make. Over the last 2 years, I've given the lecture on global Christianity and eschatology at the Developing a Christian Mind conferences at Oxford.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And one of the arguments that I make is that if you just look at popular secular culture, it is constantly referencing these ideas of heaven, hell, the afterlife, and eschatology in some way.
Mm-hmm.
There are a number of Disney movies,
Yeah.
Coco, Raya,
Mm-hmm.
but there are so many of them that touch on the afterlife
Yeah.
and appeal to the curiosity about the afterlife that consumers of Disney content will inevitably have.
Mm-hmm.
And and so what I argue is that popular culture is very much enthralled with this idea of the afterlife. Even if you look at Netflix, The Good Life,
Yeah.
is a
Yeah.
very popular show on Netflix. There's one called Touched by an Angel.
Yeah.
This isn't
Yeah.
on Netflix.
Yeah.
This is a bit older,
Yeah.
but there's that one. There's another one I think called Hellbound
Mm-hmm.
on Netflix, which is more I think based in Korea or Japan, somewhere in East Asia. The point that I want to make is that there are so many different spaces within popular culture, especially entertainment, that have acknowledged
Mm.
that the afterlife, the concepts of heaven and hell, etc., these are significant points of reflection for humans,
Yeah.
period. But that being said, as Christians, these should not be the places that educate us about how we should think about the afterlife. The
Yeah.
Bible should be.
Yeah.
There's this almost popular myth that the Bible doesn't really speak about heaven and hell and the afterlife. That is completely false.
Mm.
There are hundreds, literally hundreds of verses in the Bible,
Yeah.
from Genesis to Revelation, from the Old Testament to the New, that speak about eternity, the afterlife, heaven and hell, etc. And what I really want to drive home to the listeners is that you should focus on what Scripture says,
Yeah.
and then read books like Surprised by Hope and Heaven by Alcorn and others to supplement that, to help your scriptural literacy and your eschatological literacy go to the next level.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you should always privilege Scripture,
Yeah.
not secular culture, because the secular culture is producing productions that appeal to the human interest in the afterlife to make money,
Mm-hmm.
not to foster a Christianly sense of spirituality and devotion amongst the global Christian population of 2.5 billion people.
Yeah. And I guess stepping back, so I mean, if you're listening to this, you might be thinking, okay, what has this got to do with my day-to-day life? Like, why do I need to actually think about heaven and hell? So I think one of the things that I took away from the Surprised by Hope is that once you have a informed and correct understanding of the resurrection and I guess the afterlife, as it were, or as he calls it, life after the afterlife, or he says life
I think
after
it's
death.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
The afterlife, something
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah. It actually informs how you live out your day-to-day life. So that is the surprise of the hope, right? So once the resurrection is the hope. And if you fully understand what it means, you're not going to think that your day-to-day work is meaningless, because to his point, when you look in Revelations chapter 21 and 22, you'll see that there's actually a new heaven and a new earth where, in a sense, where we will be working, where it won't just be about worship, because it makes a point at some point in the book that most of us Christians take Revelation chapter 4 as this is the worship at the throne. We see that as heaven, but actually, and he says that that's incomplete. When you go to the end, you see that there's actually more to it. And so I guess what the point is, as I've said already, that
Mm.
understanding what life is going to be like once we cross into the other side and once we are resurrected will actually inform how we live. And he used this fantastic analogy. He says that our work on earth is, as in this life, is like somebody who learns a language, say you learn Greek, and after you've learned Greek, you're able to read Homer, or you're able to read the different Greeks. I mean, I was going to say the Bible, but it's a different type of Greek. But you get New
Hmm.
Testament, but you get like it opens your eyes to new. You're able to do a lot more. So that's the analogy to use, is that our work and the way we live our lives now in this side is almost like training for us to have this experience or use it in the afterlife. So it's so that it means that our work is not meaningless. I hope that makes sense.
Hmm. Perfect sense. Perfect sense. Yes, and I think that, and Randy Alcorn makes this argument in his book that a lot of Christians don't look forward to heaven because they think, one, it's boring. They think it's just literally standing in like some massive, eschatological or heavenly arena for
Mm-hmm.
all eternity and singing. But that is not the picture
Mm-hmm.
and the imagery of the new creation that is promoted in the New Testament
Yeah.
restrictively. It's that, but it's also so much more than that.
Mm-hmm.
You look at Revelation 20, chapters 21 and 22, and it goes into detail into these things. And so, but also, and this is a point that needs to be made. One of the most centrally defining characteristics of our God is that He's a creative God.
Yeah.
And when He created humans, He created them to be co-creators
Yeah.
in His cosmos.
Yeah.
Work is a manifestation of that creativity.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think one of the difficulties of living in a fallen world at the moment is that a lot of individuals are doing work and jobs that they hate,
Yeah.
that they don't
Yeah.
like.
Yeah.
So when they think of work, they're like, oh my gosh, you mean I got to do this for eternity? This
Yeah.
is horrible. They're like, oh my, send me to hell. I'll be all right. Maybe hell will be just like a big nightclub and we can dance with, whoever down there. Like, no, that's not the imagery and the substance of the new creation vision that is communicated in the New Testament. And Alcorn makes this argument, and N.T. Wright engages with this issue as well. The work that we'll be doing in eternity is work that brings us great fulfillment
Yeah.
and work that contributes to enhancing the beauty and the goodness of creation in ways that glorify God.
Yeah. As it was in
All
Genesis 1
exactly.
before the fall.
It's interesting. As an academic, everything that I write, every lecture that I give, every conference I speak at, every talk I do, whatever, I genuinely view every one of those engagements as an activity of worship. That's
Mm.
what it is.
Yeah.
That's what it is. That's why I don't believe in this whole just, write something just to get it done. No.
Mm.
If everything that I do is an act of worship and I'm worshiping God, then I'm going to do my best to make sure that every assignment that I complete and deliver is acceptable to be presented to the Lord as a sacrifice.
Yeah.
And when we think eschatologically and in the new creation, the work that you're going to be doing in the new creation is going to be the work perhaps that you were never able to do on this earth,
Yeah.
but you
Yeah.
really wanted to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when we really get down to the heart of the matter, and Jean articulated this beautifully, this life and the work that we do is a warm up. It's a practice round for what we'll do in eternity, and it will get even better in eternity.
Mm.
Work is worship, and the work that we will do in eternity will be work that we will love doing, will enjoy doing it. We'll do it in community with other believers and members of the brideship of Christ,
Yeah.
and it will bring us a sense of satisfaction and joy that will be nourishing to our ontology, to our souls, to our spirits for eternity. And
Amen.
that is something not just to look forward to, but to look forward to with excitement. And I
Yeah.
think that's one of the reasons why the title of N.T. Wright's book, Surprised by Hope, is so appropriate.
Mm.
Because when you truly internalize this argument and this idea and this vision of the new creation that is presented in the New Testament, it instills within you a sense of eschatological hope
Yeah.
that I would also argue immediately leads to an eschatological expectation grounded in joy and
Mm.
trust
Yeah.
that God knows what He's doing
Yeah.
and it's going to be great.
Yeah. No, that's I mean, yeah, that's what it is. And I think just building on that, I think he makes the point that it will also lead us to engaging what is beautiful on the earth in terms of culture and the arts, and engaging justice, and at the same time also engaging evangelism. He doesn't see them as three different things. They're all supposed to be intertwined or interconnected as
Mm-hmm.
part of this hope that you've described.
Yes.
So we kind of touched on this briefly around the challenges with the book. I mean, we agree both that it's theologically dense.
Mm-hmm.
If you've never read a book by a theologian, I would say you need to take it in stages. Like,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
take a few breaks. And also I think there's the challenge around the doctrine. So many of us are used to doctrines that, as I said before, have been informed by other things that are not the New Testament. And I never made this point that one of the things that happens in biblical theology, biblical theology is a subset of theology for those that aren't aware, is biblical theology tries to understand what the authors were thinking of, or how those who read it at the time interpreted the text,
Mm-hmm.
versus how culture over 2,000 years, because obviously the Bible varies. I mean, let's just assume, just for simplicity, we'll say it's 2,000 years old. There has been a lot of interpretation over the years. And so some of our current understandings are based on those 2,000 years of interpretation, as opposed to what is written in the text. So I would say those are the two main challenges. Would you have anything else to add on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think another point to highlight is whenever we talk about interpretation, there's always inevitably the question of, well, how do we know what is the right interpretation?
Mm, mm,
Uh, the evolution of the Bible is one that has been heavily politicized,
mm-hmm.
and there are obvious linguistic and literary challenges
Yeah.
that apply as well. But when I contemplate these challenges, I'm immediately reminded of what Christ said when he spoke about the juxtaposition of the letter of the law and the spirit of the law.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that when it comes to eschatology and doctrine and these issues, I would argue that every Christian is called to have a highly developed sense of spiritual discernment
Mm,
that enables them to differentiate between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law
yeah.
as it relates to any subject. And I think eschatology is one of those.
Yeah, I'm actually glad you said that, because most people outside of the more traditional churches see theology as a discipline of just the law, and that the
Hmm.
spirit can be lost. So I'm glad you brought that
Hmm.
point up. So we've actually said quite a lot, but before we wrap up,
Uh-huh.
could you maybe share with us any reading habits you may have? Because this is a podcast about books,
Yes.
and you're a theologian, so I'm guessing you read a lot of books. So do you
Uh-huh.
have any
Correct.
secret tips that you can share with us?
Yeah, I think one of the things that might be surprising to people when I explain my reading habits is that I actually read very slowly because I'm not in a rush. I read very slowly and I'm always taking notes. So when I read something, like if I read a chapter, it will take me longer than other colleagues to read it, but I will have systematically deconstructed that chapter to a degree
Mm,
that gives me an understanding of that content and material in ways that I could deliver multiple lectures on it. So I think that, growing up, I remember being in high school and feeling like, when a good reader is a fast reader.
yeah.
And that's not true. I think a good reader is a reader that comprehends deeply.
Mm,
So I would say, one, always take notes when you're reading. Two, slow down a bit. What is the rush? What is the point of reading a book in a day if you can't recall 10% of what you read?
yeah.
I would rather read 10% of a book and recall 60 to 80% of that chapter
Yeah.
or that 10% than read an entire book and barely be able to recall any of it.
Mm, mm, mm.
One, I think, is more so about, and it gets back to that idea of, the letter versus the spirit. If you read the book and you say, oh, yeah, I read the book, that's the letter of the law. I've read the book, boom, it's done. But are you conversant in the arguments and the concepts within that book?
Mm,
Do you understand the spirit of what those arguments, of what is driving those arguments?
mm-hmm.
So I think there's those bits. I would also say it's important to read widely and diversely.
Yeah.
So I try to read a good mix of theology, but also global politics. Uh, I'm reading Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I'm rereading
Mm-hmm.
Mary Shelley's Frankenstein at the moment. It's a classic, and I really like it.
Mm-hmm.
I read lots of different news outlets. So yes, there's the BBC, there's the New York Times, there's Al Jazeera, there's the Economist, there's the Financial Times, there's all of those. And I think this is another thing. I listen to a lot of podcasts,
Yeah.
and so I think the point that I want to make here is reading isn't just about sitting down and reading a book for the whole
Mm-hmm.
day.
Yeah.
Reading ultimately is about consuming knowledge, information, and data.
Mm-hmm.
And so on a daily basis, I consume a lot
Yeah.
of knowledge, information, and data because yes, there are times in which I'm sitting down and reading, but I'm also listening to a podcast,
Yeah.
or I'm listening to a sermon, or I'm listening to an apologetics exercise between John Lennox and Richard Dawkins or something,
Mm-hmm.
that's on YouTube. So I think read slowly, take notes, read diversely, and then this is the last point I want to make. I believe in the concept of the joy of your education.
Yeah.
And I think every time that you read, you should have this sense of, I am bettering myself, I'm growing, but it's also, there should be a joy at the heart of that.
Yeah.
Anytime that you read and you get into this system of existence where reading is drudgery rather than joy, I think you want to take a step back and unpack why are you feeling that way?
Wow.
Because
Wow.
where there is no joy, there is no sustainability.
Mm.
And I
That's
think
really
that
helpful.
I think that being a lifelong reader and a lifelong consumer of diverse information, data, and knowledge has to a large extent, be rooted in the experience of joy.
Yeah. Wow. And then I guess lastly, what would be your top 3 Christian book recommendations, excluding Surprised by Hope?
Okay, great question. C.S. Lewis is a giant of
Yeah.
Christian writing. I would say the Screwtape Letters.
Mm-hmm.
I love that book. And also The Great Divorce of
Yeah.
his. I love that book as well. And then I would actually say go and read Randy Alcorn's Heaven.
Yeah.
Those
Yeah.
3, because it's important. The truth of the matter is, not every writer, Christian writer that writes about eschatology is going to write in a densely theological way.
Yeah.
If that writing style bothers you, that's okay, but there are other options.
Mm-hmm.
You can read, Randy Alcorn, and you can read others. And also, I mean, there are other theologians that are even more dense than N.T. Wright. So, theological denseness exists on a spectrum. So
Yeah.
I would say for any Christian who's listening to this podcast who wants to read a book on eschatology that is also enjoyable to read and accessible, Heaven by Randy Alcorn. I would highly recommend that book.
Brilliant. Well, Chris, thank you so much for your time. This has really been enlightening. And I don't say that lightly. It's a different format from what we've used to, but I think it's been good for our audience, and appreciate your time, and thanks for coming along.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Gene. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for organizing this platform and for your leadership of it. And I hope you know that the work that you're doing is sacred work and that many people are benefiting from it. So God bless you. Thank you for what you're doing, and keep it up, my friend.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're
God
welcome.
bless. Chris and I got so caught up in the conversation that I forgot to ask him about ways you can stay in touch. Dr. Chris runs a consulting firm called Wadibia & Co., which provides solutions for actors in any sector responding to the growing number of faith-based challenges confronting our world today. Wadibia & Company provides solutions for a diverse range of actors, including foundations, banks, insurance companies, military organizations, and faith-based institutions. I'm sure you can tell that he knows what he's talking about. You can find out more at www.wadibia.co.uk. That's www.wadibia.co.uk. I will include the link in the show notes, as well as a link to his TEDx talk and the article he wrote in the Times. And, as ever, a link to Surprised by Hope and his other book recommendations. I hope this episode has piqued your interest in developing a solid theology of what our lives will be like when we get to heaven. I have personally been on a theological journey in this space. My understanding of heaven has really begun to shape how I live my life in this life. If this episode has challenged you as much as it's challenged me, then why not rate and review this podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts? It really helps the algorithms get the podcast into the hands of other potential listeners. Better still, why not tell a friend about this podcast? You can share it on your WhatsApp or iMessenger. Anywho, that's all from me. Thanks for listening. God willing, I'll be back in your ears next month. Until then, keep reading and seeking the Lord. God bless. Bye.